Hey guys, kamusta? My name is Victor, and in today's video, I'm going to show you guys how to take cinematic low light photos. In this video, we're going to cover camera settings, each settings, and why I chose to use them, and then tips and tricks, and also we're going to edit a few photos so that you guys know the editing style and kind of how to emulate this cinematic look. Okay, so first things first, you're gonna set your camera to RAW, and compress or uncompress, it doesn't really matter. And then second thing is that we're gonna turn picture profile off because, like I said, it doesn't matter when you're shooting RAW, it's all gonna be the same. And Gerald and Dunn actually has done all the picture profiles in RAW, and there's literally very little difference on different picture profiles. So let's turn that off and you get to see what you're actually shooting. Next is setting your exposure bracket to 0 or plus 0.3. And we're gonna set the metering to highlights only. The reason why we're doing this is because we want to retain as much information on the highlights, and we can recover a lot in the shadows, especially with Sony cameras. It's really good in low light, but in order to achieve these types of images, we have to retain the highlight information. So that's why we're keeping it 0 to plus 0.3 only. So the next steps are optional settings and why I have these settings. But for me, this is what I use for street photography. I do auto white balance, and there's no harm in doing auto white balance or auto settings as long as you know what you're doing. And also it's very important because you don't want to tinker with your settings and then you miss the shot that you want to take, right? The second one is to set your ISO to auto, set it to minimum of 100 and maximum to 1600. And normally this is a good range so that the camera can expose it properly for you. Last but not least, you're gonna set your camera to aperture mode. So the only thing you're tinkering is the aperture. If you wanna let light in, put it all the way to 1.4, 1.8, whatever you have, and that is it. Hit that shutter button and you have yourself a low light cinematic photo. Not yet, because we're gonna edit and I'll show you guys how to do it. Okay, we're gonna go over kind of what the gear I use, the lenses and filters. So what kind of lenses do I use for these photos? Normally a prime lens. My favorite is the 24G Master Lens 1.4, and it's pretty good. Like, it's very versatile. It's wide enough where I can go close up and I can frame my shots beautifully with this. 35mm as well, 1.4 or 1.8, both works. Again, any prime lens and that you have a fast aperture, it works with this camera. I suggest at least 2.8 for full frame cameras and about 1.8 for APS-C. I suggest Sigma prime lenses. They have the 30mm 1.4, 16mm 1.4, and those lenses are great for street photography. Okay, there's only one filter that I use for night photography, and that is the Pro Mist filter 1/8. And I don't want to use a stronger diffusion filter because the halation, the glow is too big. I want it to kind of be subtle and kind of just add that little look into it instead of like, hey, I'm using a filter and you know that I'm using a filter. Okay, let's move on to tips and tricks. So when heading out, I usually use my composition to the max. I mainly do videos for freelance work, so I shoot landscape, and I tried shooting vertically and for Instagram and I just didn't like it. So all my compositions are horizontal. I shoot 16:9 and I try to compose it like a video, like a cinematic look. One thing with the composition as well is because you want to have an interesting photo, and without the composition, especially street low light photography, it's super busy, there's too many lights, and you really want to hone in to your subject, which leads into the second tip, is create a subject. No matter what it is, someone cooking on the kitchen, or a street vendor, or maybe someone walking, pick a subject. It can even be, if you want some neon signs or some buildings, like you focus on one building, you focus on the windows. Doesn't matter what it is. You have to focus on something because, again, at nighttime, there's so many different lights that you really can be distracted with all the looks. These lights are just there to add depth into your photo, especially when there's a subject in line and you compose your photo properly. That means that the distraction becomes depth and it just literally adds to the image. And last but not least, I suggest to find some lighting that makes your subject a little bit more interesting. And you see this in low light photography. They use neon signs, they use like different outdoor lighting. Ultimately, you want to make a 2D photo 3D with depth, lighting, and composition. With these three in mind, you're gonna have a three-dimensional photo. Not necessarily 3D, but you can feel the depth in the photos, and that's kind of what makes it automatic. That's what kind of makes it feel alive. A 2D photo looking like you're immersed in that environment. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's one very great photographer I worked with before, and that's his main tip, and it stuck to me, that you have to make a 2D image 3D with the depth, lighting, and composition. So here I am sharing it with you guys. Okay, so let's get into editing right now. We have Lightroom open, and I have the set of photos from that night. And we're actually going to edit this one photo that I'm very fond of, and I think this is it. I think I already cropped it. Yep. Let's just go back to how it was. So initially when the photo is, I took this way because I wanted to capture this whole pillar right here, but the framing is a little bit off, and I want to compose it right in the middle of the shot of the door right here, and that is my focal point. And this kind of reminds me of like a scene from a movie when they're establishing a shot of a location, and you're gonna go in to have a conversation like Glystone in there. So, okay, let's start with exposure, and we're gonna start immediately with the highlights because we want to get this recovered. We don't want it blown out like this. And the secret to that is what I mentioned before, is that we're gonna expose for the highlights, because if it was exposed for the multi-exposure for the whole frame, it's gonna look something like this. And if you took a photo something like this, the lights will be blown out. You won't be able to recover that. Okay, so yeah, let's go back to whites. I like it a little bit bright because you kind of want it illuminated, and just how lights work. And then let's move on to shadows. I want to recover a little bit of this, maybe a little bit this wall as well. Okay, and then bring down the whites a little bit so that the overall whites will go down, so that you have that little, like that dark night moody look. Blacks I'll touch a little bit later on if I want more contrast in the image, but so far I think everything is looking good. Everything's like just looking like everything's well exposed, and that's how you want it as a cinematic photo. Okay, so let's go underneath exposure, which is texture, and I usually just put it to +1 because I want the grains to pop up a little bit. Clarity I usually do -9, under -10 to 0 because I don't want it too sharpened. Dehaze, I do want a little bit of that so it gets a little bit more information on the highlights and in the shadows. For the vibrance and saturation, I'll actually play with that later because we're gonna play with the colors and color grade this photo. Okay, so now we're going to do an S-curve, which is very typical on a night shoot. And I do want to clip a little bit of the highlight. The shadows not so much, because if I lift this up, it just would look like it's a faded photo. So I'm just gonna go a little bit of the midtones right here, lower midtones. Okay, so I got the contrast that I wanted. Okay, and then we'll touch on the next tone curves later. Next up is the HSL sliders, and this is where the color grading happens. It's actually not done until we hit the color grading, but this is the magic. This is where the magic happens. So I want the reds a little bit on the pink side, so that you kind of get that reddish look rather than the orange look. Similar to the reds, we're gonna push the orange to closer to the reds. Perfect. So like if if I exaggerate this, look at how it goes, and it kind of has that really cyberpunk feel already, but it, for me, doesn't look good right now. I want this a little bit red orange. Now the yellows, I kind of want to match it. And then for greens, I usually drag it all the way to the yellow side. And then these don't matter because, actually it might, because it's getting there. It won't matter because all I'm going to do here is that I'm going to desaturate all of these. Sometimes like I just leave them -90 around that, but the greens will completely be desaturated. Okay, now the yellows, we're going to reduce a little bit of that, but I do want to retain just a tad. And then orange, I'm going to brighten it up a little bit, or saturate it a little bit, and also the reds, so it's a little bit more prominent. We're losing color on this jacket, and I kind of want to retain that. Perfect. Okay, that's good. Luminance I don't really touch that much because we're already like in good exposure here, so we're just gonna leave it like that. But sometimes I do want to touch the orange luminance so that I can get the brightness a little bit on the lower side, but so far I think this is perfect. Okay, so now to finish this look kind of and to have that cinematic color grade, we're gonna push the shadows to your cooler side. So if we go exaggerate, see what happens here. And you kind of just want to pick where you want it to be. So I really like it on the teal side right here. And see how it's like too much. I'm just gonna bring it a little bit. So if we start with 0 and just slide it just a tad, and then the photo's almost done. It's like the final product. For the highlights, I do want to keep the same for the overall mood, and then I'm gonna keep this, and then have the midtones as orange. Perfect. I think we are almost done. I think this is a little bit strong. A little bit on cooler side. Okay, perfect. Okay, blending. Okay, I want it a little bit to be blue and balancing it off. Perfect. Sharpening, I completely put that to 0, and then I do auto so that everything's level. Lens corrections, I don't usually use lens corrections, and then sometimes I use grain. Like I embrace the grain even though I have a full frame camera. It's just, it adds characteristics and texture to the photo itself. But we're gonna leave it for now. I don't usually touch the calibrations because I think we're done with the photo. And let's see the back and forth. Here's the first, and this is the after, before and after. It's kind of cool. I do want it side by side. And now we have this little cinematic photo, like an establishing shot pretty much. Anyways, that's about it for this video, guys. And if you guys enjoyed this and you learned something from it, feel free to tag me on Instagram. I'd love to see what you come up with these settings, and I hope you guys achieve this look as well. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to comment down below. I'll see you guys in the next video.